It is indeed a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. I've never been at the Institute before. I'll confess I really didn't know much about it, and it's just been a delight seeing the gem that you have in your community here and being at least a little part of it. I could have named this talk, How Activism Has Driven the Conversation About the Future of Food, how we farm, how we eat, what's safe, what's sustainable. You know, as I've always listened to introductions, and I've had a few in my day, I've always thought they left a lot out. They always give you somebody's academic pedigree and what they're interested in, but you don't, at the end of it, know really very much about them. So I decided to take a minute to tell you a little bit about me. And you'll see why I think that's important, at least I hope. I grew up in Southern California. My time split between the San Diego area and a farm that we had out in Escondido, California that raised avocados, persimmons, and grapes, and we made some pretty darn good wine as well. I should say my father has a background of having spent part of his youth in the Catskills. So originally the family is from New York, of which we are understandably proud. So I have a little bit of a farm background. You heard that I went to Cornell. What you didn't hear was that although my degree is in biochemistry, the lab I worked in was in the Graduate School of Nutrition, which in those days had a strong focus on hunger in the world and international nutrition. And I became very sensitized to the fact that there are literally more than 1 billion people in the world who go to bed hungry every night. And so that is actually one of the things I've kept foremost in my mind as I think about food and food safety. The other thing is, of course, I have a family. I have a daughter in Knoxville, Tennessee with 2 children, a son in Champaign, Illinois with 2 children, and my youngest grandson, who was produced by a PhD in nutrition from UC Davis and a PhD in ag chemistry from UC Davis, little Orion, a couple of years ago. And so this is Orion's first trip to a seafood restaurant in Seattle. I think he's probably about 3 or 4 months old when this was taken. And yeah, we're pretty happy, but I had a sober thought. And this is no joke. I was sitting there looking at Orion and you know, saw all the promise. I started thinking about some of the challenges that we face collectively in the world with regard to food. I started thinking about those 1 billion hungry people and thinking about 9 or 10 billion people in the world and some of the sustainability and climate change problems, which I'll mention again in a moment, and sort of thought that maybe we have a responsibility to Ori's generation to do better than we've done. And I'll return to that at the very end, how we might do a little better. One of the things, whether we're in or around agriculture or in a city, is that we do share a lot of common beliefs, a lot of common needs, a lot of common values. We sure all need to eat. Most of us do care about future generations, and that's why we care about sustainability, and we understand that what we're doing today isn't perfectly sustainable, not in agriculture, not in industry, not in our own homes. Most of us assume that food is safe and that we get pretty indignant when it's not. The United Nations Charter actually has an article devoted to the fact that people have a right to adequate food. And I wonder if the 1 billion people that don't have adequate food ever remind them of that. Obviously, they're pretty disenfranchised. You know, we waste too much, and we're trying to do something about that in the food and agricultural system. We use too much, and some of us show it. All agriculture leaves an environmental footprint. That's just a fact of life. And we have to figure out a way to minimize that footprint. One of the things I've dealt with, because I work in a controversial area, food safety and particularly in genetically modified foods, is that everybody has an opinion about agriculture in today's world. But 99% of us don't live in or near a farm. And we may read authors like Michael Pollan, who will inform us about his peculiar view of agriculture, and then we may, in fact, read something by a farmer who would take issue with what Michael Pollan has to say because he's out on the farm and doesn't see it quite the same way. Whatever the case, everybody has an opinion. Well, while we share all these things in common, and we're looking, you know, for solutions that are acceptable to all of us, there's quite a difference of opinion about what to do with some of the issues that confront us. Basically going to talk about GMOs, chemicals, and other yucky things in our food, and the scientific controversy about GMOs and some chemicals. I'm going to talk mostly about chemicals today. But I really want to focus on where the public develops its perceptions and attitudes about risky things in food. And in my conclusions, maybe talk about what we can or should do about it. So now I want to turn to some of the things the public is concerned about in food. And you'll see these in newspaper and on TV all the time, lots of articles written about them. You know, it's the chemicals in your food, it's whether vaccinations give you autism, it's not wanting to have hormones. I mean, you can read that list faster than I can read it off. And you hear these topics discussed all the time. What agricultural scientists around the world are worrying about is the world population is going to grow to about 10 billion people by 2050. The amount of land that we have in the world that's farmed actually decreases by 1.6% every year. We have shrinking water resources and soil resources and diminishing quality of those. We don't know what climate change is going to do to agriculture. We do know there are probably going to be winners and there are going to be losers. Places we could never farm will be farmed, and places we now farm will become unfarmable. But we don't know how that's going to shake out. There is a big focus on sustainability, inefficiency, and waste. And the United Nations tells us, the Food and Agriculture Organization, that by 2050, we have to increase food production in the world by 70%, which is a formidable challenge. I want to introduce a term that isn't commonly used. I mean, many of you may well know it, but that's the term meme. A meme is kind of set to rhyme with gene. How many here know what a meme is? Not a lot. Okay, so a meme is just like a gene. It's a parcel of information that gets passed around, but it's not passed the way genetics is passed around. It's passed by people talking to people, and cultures become infected with memes and pass ideas along. And we're a little sheep-like in this. Genes are kind of infectious by imitation. And that's why you see whole groups of people acquiring certain habits and certain ideas, like you shouldn't take MSG, right? Food says on it, no MSG. Completely innocuous chemical. When you do double-blind tests on people who say they're sensitive to MSG, even if they're convinced of it, no one ever reacts to MSG. So there's a meme that doesn't have any basis in fact, but is widely believed. And I'm going to return to some memes several times in this talk. I want to start by going through a number of examples of messaging that's designed to create fear in consumers that consumers really are concerned about, and look at the science underneath that messaging. So this is just going to be a random string of some of the more popular ones that I deal with during the day. The Dirty Dozen are the 12 fruits and vegetables that have the most pesticide residues on them. What the Dirty Dozen does is supposedly it calculates how much of various kinds of pesticides are present in all the crops in the supermarket and tells you which ones you should avoid. This year, strawberries took the sweepstakes and apples dropped to second, which should be a source of happiness for if there are any apple growers from upstate New York here. I want you to note a couple other things on this page. Focus on strawberries and grow organics. Just keep those in mind. Winter and Francis at UC Davis did an analysis of the 2010 Dirty Dozen. They do this every year, obviously. And what they observed, and I don't expect you really to be able to read this slide, but let me explain one thing on it. It's got a thing called an RFD. Now that's a number that the EPA uses to estimate how much of something you could eat every day for the rest of your life without any harm, or being right at the borderline where harm might start to take place. But it has a safety factor of 100 or 1,000 built into it. So that if you keep your intake below an RFD, since you've got a 1,000-fold safety factor built in, you're not going to be bothered by a pesticide or anything else at that level. If you look at the first couple columns, which is how many of these fruits and vegetables had even a single occasion of something that reached the RFD, it's 0. And the second column, which is 10 to 100% of an RFD, it's 0. And if you look at 1 to 10% of an RFD, there's only one example of bell peppers out of the different samples that they tested that were above it. The bottom line is that the actual amount of these pesticides that's present is infinitesimal and far below the level at which they could conceivably have any biological activity. And that's what toxicologists tell us The conclusions that Winter and Katz came to were that these consumer exposures were, of course, several orders of magnitude below levels required to cause any biological effect. But they also observed by reading the paper and explained this, and they were very charitable when they said this, the methods that they used to calculate pesticide exposure weren't adequate to draw the conclusions they made, meaning the study is complete junk. They just took a bunch of numbers and ranked them rather than looked at how much people were actually confronted with. Remember I told you there were strawberries on the first page? And to remember that link, that's a story about how great strawberries are to eat and why you should eat more strawberries because they're so healthy, which appears on the same page where strawberries are #1 on the Dirty Dozen list. By the way, there was also an organic, eat organic message on that page. The Environmental Working Group receives funding from the organic industry. If you want some good information about pesticide residues in foods, I would highly recommend going to Safe Fruits and Veggies. They actually have a calculator that allows you to calculate how much of any particular fruit or vegetable, based on the known pesticide residues, you can consume and still stay below an RFD. Frequently, you have to eat like 1,000 pounds or something to reach an RFD in a day. And there's a lot of other information about pesticides on this page. And there's another page which answers the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15, which are the lowest things on the list. A lot of expert information and good things if you have to talk to, especially if you're a farmer that sprays pesticides and you have to talk to your neighbors, a lot of really good information about what the risks are and aren't with pesticides. So the conclusion that I would draw from all of this is that consumers are scared a lot about pesticides, and it's pretty deliberate. And a lot of that's funded by the organic industry, which sells what? Pesticide-free food, right? No pesticides used on our food. Well, that turns out to be another lie. Insects do not refuse to eat organic foods just because they're organic. Organic farmers use pesticides. They actually use some of the same pesticides that conventional farmers use because the organic rules allow them to be used. There are over 150 chemicals that are allowed to be used in organic agriculture, and you can measure many of the same residues on organic products as you can on conventional products, neither posing any risk to consumers. So I guess it's something we need to get over. Let me move to another example of people being scared about something that shouldn't scare them. It's a little different. It's kind of related to genetically engineered foods. Jeff Smith at the Institute for what I call irresponsible technology, he calls it responsible technology. Jeff accuses GM foods of causing autism because the rate of increase of autism has been almost identical or parallel to the rate of increase of consumption or planting of GM foods. Well, there are a lot of problems with that. First of all, it's a logical fallacy to suggest that if one thing happens after another thing, that the first thing caused the second thing. And it's all based on anecdotes anyway. We're not talking about evidence, and we're not talking about scientific papers. But maybe one way to really deal with Jeff is to point out the increase in organic food sales over the same period of time exactly parallels the increase in autism. Isn't that interesting? Means nothing, obviously. There's a link here to a really nice article about what does and doesn't cause autism. I'm a little sensitive about it because I have a grandchild with autism and I read a lot about it and know a lot about it. It turns out that activists seem to use it a lot because it really scares people, but they've blamed autism on a whole bunch of different things. I wish they'd make up their mind as to what it is that actually causes autism. Let me go on to another one, and this one is a little more science-y, and that's trashing glyphosate. How many of you have used Roundup? Oh, come on. Yeah, how do you kill the weeds in your sidewalk? You use Roundup, right? Glyphosate is the most popular herbicide in the world. It's a really interesting compound. What it does basically is that phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan are amino acids that we need to build proteins. Humans and most animals can't synthesize these, so they're essential amino acids for most higher organisms. But bacteria and plants actually can synthesize these, and they have a biochemical pathway by which they make these. And it turns out that there's an enzyme in that pathway that's sensitive to glyphosate, which is a structural analog of the substrate of that enzyme. And by knocking out that enzyme, the plants can't make phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan, and they literally die from starvation for these 3 amino acids, which are essential to making proteins. They can't make proteins, so that's tough. Actually, this glyphosate is the essential ingredient in Roundup, but there is another ingredient. There's a surfactant, which is like a detergent that helps the glyphosate get into the plant. And the surfactant is a lot more toxic and potentially harmful to aquatic life than the glyphosate itself, because glyphosate is about as toxic as salt or baking soda. We really don't absorb it, and when we do, we excrete it very rapidly, and there's just mountains of toxicological research that lead to the conclusion that it's the safest herbicide in use today. And it's also the most widely used herbicide in the world because of that. It also has the broadest specificity of any herbicide. So it's pretty interesting compound. And I just threw this in there so that if you want to go look up some references on safety, you've got them as a reference. About 10 years ago, papers started appearing, almost all of them flawed in one way or another, probably shouldn't have been approved for a peer-reviewed journal, that started making claims about glyphosate, negative health claims about glyphosate in animals or humans. They'd be papers like, for example, a computer scientist at MIT who claims she's a holistic nutritionist says that glyphosate can cause concussions. More off the wall is a computer scientist who did a modeling simulation in which he predicted that formaldehyde would be formed in our bodies by exposure to glyphosate. And formaldehyde is indeed very toxic, and that would be very bad, but he never measured anything and didn't do any lab work. He just simulated this in his computer. And there, of course, no evidence that glyphosate's toxic, so it's clearly not making formaldehyde in our bodies. The real death blow to glyphosate, a virtual death blow, is that the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is constituted by the World Health Organization of the United Nations and supported by them, routinely reviews all sorts of things. This is their mission for whether they present a hazard of carcinogenicity. That's their mission, is to understand the literature on carcinogens and to evaluate whether things should be considered non-carcinogenic, possibly carcinogenic, probably carcinogenic, or for sure carcinogenic. And those are their categories. And they concluded that glyphosate was a probable carcinogen, in spite of all the papers that say that it's not a carcinogen. What they did is they focused on 3 epidemiology studies. An epidemiology study is where you look at a population and you look at the incidence of something. It can't tell you cause and effect. It can't explain a mechanism by which something might happen. It's just simply an association, just like the autism and organic food association. That would be what that would be an epidemiological result. They had these 3 epidemiology studies that were based on human memory recall, notoriously unreliable, that determined that a rare form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma occurred in people who were exposed to, and animals that were exposed to glyphosate, and they therefore said it's a probable carcinogen. Really bad scientific conclusion, totally disagreed with by all the rest of the toxicologists in the world. And part of the reason that they reached this conclusion is that any work that had been funded by industry, any worker who had worked for industry, who had accepted research from industry, or consulted for industry, any paper that had any involvement with industry, or industry scientists, was excluded, which, as you can imagine, with a commercial herbicide, there was a lot of industry research associated. So they threw out the body of work on glyphosate and reached this study. I'm just giving you a link here to why IARC and IARC alone would make this conclusion. So that's one story. Another story is that after that conclusion was made, activist groups jumped on this and started doing things like Moms Across America publishing testing of breast milk, urine, and water for Roundup or glyphosate. Michelle McGuire, a young faculty member at Washington State, looked at those claims and found, in fact, there is no glyphosate in mother's milk. So she was immediately accused of being a shill for industry and on the take, and just simply an apologist for the poison that industry was peddling. The European Food Safety Agency was forced to review glyphosate again, and just the other day, the European Union has extended the approval of glyphosate for 7 years, saying there's no basis for believing that glyphosate is a carcinogen. This in a very precautionary political system, the European Union. The EPA is undergoing a similar review, but in the meantime, the drum keeps beating at activist websites and in the media and on the press that we have to now consider glyphosate dangerous. What's really dangerous about this is if we shift away from glyphosate, it'll be a shift to more toxic herbicides, and some of them are carcinogenic. Here's what's not known. There was a guy by the name of Christopher Portier who worked for CDC, has a PhD, is a good scientist, but his whole career has always hated pesticides and chemicals. He's opposed to them, and has worked with the anti-pesticide NGO, the Environmental Defense Fund, which is also partially funded by the organic industry. He put the glyphosate on the agenda at the IARC with which he had become associated, and he was the sole external expert that drove their findings about glyphosate. They did not reveal this relationship, neither did the IARC. Going to close with another important pesticide. The reason I'm picking these is they're really important herbicides and pesticides. Neonicotinoids are really interesting pesticides. You use them as seed coatings, and they migrate into the plant as it grows, and so the plant is only toxic to insects that feed on the plant. Very much like the genetically modified products that have insect resistance built into them. It sort of works the same way, which is cool because then you don't have any non-target deaths. You don't kill insects you don't want to kill. And so neonics have become very popular. They're very potent. Very small amounts of them kill the target insects. But they got blamed by the activists for colony collapse disorder. You've all heard of colony collapse disorder, I hope. A few years back, it was a big issue. All the bee colonies were dying. Well, and they called it beepocalypse. Well, that caused the European Union to suspend the use of neonics. That again causes a shift to less environmentally friendly chemicals and major farm yield losses. And these environmentally unfriendly chemicals actually are more toxic to bees because you spray them and you kill bees. What they found out is that it's not neonics at all. It's a multifactorial problem for the bees, with a mite called the varroa mite being the primary cause of colony collapse disorder. But the other news is that colony collapse disorder was just a couple of bad years. And right now, beehives are at their highest level they've ever been in the United States, and bee populations are relatively healthy. If that weren't true, we wouldn't have crops because 35% of our crops depend on bee pollination. So basically, this is another example of how activism has driven a pesticide off the market and scared consumers about it with no basis in science, and in fact, doing things that are incredibly illogical because the consequences of the change they advocate are worse for the environment than what they're trying to get rid of. I have to make a comment about natural. How many people here have ever bought a food product that said it was all natural? Centuries ago, Paracelsus, a Swiss scientist, said that everything's toxic. It's the dose that makes the poison. And that's a cornerstone of toxicology. It's how much you're exposed to. The other thing that we now know is that naturally occurring and synthetic compounds are actually both metabolized by a very broad spectrum set of detoxification systems that we evolved with to protect us against all of the foreign chemicals that are out in the environment. There are literally millions of alien compounds out there in a complex biosphere, and we have to be able to metabolize those effectively. And there's actually no scientific evidence that natural compounds are safer than synthetic compounds, and there are no peer-reviewed scientific papers that say natural is safer. It's an advertising gimmick, folks. We've sold the world on the idea that natural is somehow better for you. We all like to be close to nature and, the kind of the natural myth, and they're kind of appealing to that. The food industry has gone overboard, and the supplement industry, with trying to exploit consumers' fears about chemicals. The bad part, as I see it, is that some of them are actually paying surrogates to spread fear about chemicals or GMOs or antibiotics or hormones or whatever else they think will promote sales. You scare a bunch of people with one agent, and then they run around and they buy your product that says, we don't have any of that in it. And that's actually what's been going on in the consumer marketplace. So at the end of the day, this is my take on natural. I love this cartoon. This one guy is saying to the other, don't trust anything natural. People die from natural causes all the time. Let me change gears and talk about GMOs because they've been so controversial. The chart here shows you the increase in total hectares of GMOs planted in the world over roughly the last 20 years. This year is the first year that they've really showed signs of leveling off because the countries in dark green here that are growing GMOs have just about gone 100% GMO. So there's nowhere for them to go. And then we got a bunch of other countries all around the world that aren't growing GMOs. But this year, about 20 million farmers in 28 countries planted about 500,000 acres of GMOs. And most of those farmers were in developing countries, so it's important to them. It's been a very successful technology. The National Academy of Science has reviewed the impact on farm sustainability and come to the conclusion that there were very large and positive impacts on economics and sustainability in the USA because of planting GMOs for about the last 20 years. A global meta-analysis of the scientific literature, which includes 147 studies, shows big reductions in pesticide use, increased crop yields, and increased farmer profits. Here's another link to a site that discusses a number of other positive environmental outcomes from a switch to planting genetically modified crops. The most interesting one is that when you use herbicide-tolerant crops and the herbicide Roundup, for example, or glyphosate, you don't have to plow your soil. And the use of no-till agriculture means that a lot of carbon dioxide that's in the soil doesn't get turned over and escape to the atmosphere. So you see an enormous decrease in greenhouse gas emissions using no-till agriculture. It's not really the GM crop that's doing this. It's just that the use of an herbicide-tolerant crop allows the farmer to use no-till methods. But no-till is really good. Plowing soil is one of the worst things you can do for it. If you really want to ruin an acre of land, put it to the plow. It's going to erode, it's going to oxidize, it's going to give you CO2. A lot of bad things happen. So the amount of CO2 reduction that is the result of this level that you saw here of GM crop utilization in the world amounts to taking about half, or 43%, of all the registered cars off the road in the United Kingdom. It's a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The thing, as a food safety person that I find really paradoxical is that GM crops could actually be safer. The National Academy of Science, when they looked at GM crops, came to the conclusion before they were ever planted, and has 4 times since then come to the conclusion that they're as safe as any other, maybe safer, that there are no new or unknown risks in GM crops. That's what our science community tells us, and I'll get back to that point. There are actually some reasons to use GM crops for safety purposes. For example, to cut to the chase, fumonisin is a compound that causes neural tube defect babies, or spina bifida, and esophageal cancer. It's called a mycotoxin because it's produced by a mold. Here you see moldy corn. The molds grow at the site of insect damage. And if you were to eat this, you would take a pretty big dose of fumonisin. This is insect-protected GM corn. You'll notice there's no insect damage. And when you measure the fumonisin in it, it's almost zero. The British Food Safety Authority, in their concern about fumonisin, said that we don't think British subjects should be exposed to more than about 500 micrograms per kilogram of fumonisin in corn, and we'd like to know just what's out there in the supermarket. So they went to supermarkets in the UK a few years back, and they sampled 30 samples of corn. 20 of the conventional ones fell well below the 500 microgram upper level that they thought might be safe. 4 of the conventional ones were really much higher than that level, and they were concerned about that. It's a sign of poor fungus control. And the ones that were organic, the 6 of them, were phenomenally high. The reason they're phenomenally high is that Organic farmers don't have actually very good fungicides to use unless they cheat and use chemical fungicides. So it's a big problem in organic farming is actually fungicides. And what happens, of course, is that their corn ends up looking like this, and that's got lots of fumonisin, and that means that women who eat this kind of corn will have more neural tube defect babies, and the populations that eat it will have more esophageal cancer, and that has actually played out in the southwest Texas, in Guatemala, in South Africa, where populations have been looked at and the fumonisin in the corn measured, and they've actually looked at the health statistics, and it works. And we know why this is. Fumonisin happens to block folate uptake, and of course folic acid is responsible, or lack of folic acid is responsible for neurotube defect babies. So at the end of the day, I guess you could ask me the question, are GMOs safe? I think I already answered it. The National Academy of Science has looked at that question 4 times. But let's think about just a couple features of GM crops. First of all, we have to have a quiz, right? Because I'm a professor. I want you to think about and think for a moment, these are the ancestors of 3 commonly grown crops. So that's a proto-carrot, that's a proto-lettuce, and that's a proto-corn plant. These are genetically modified forms of that. They've undergone a whole bunch of mutations, random mutations, and ancient farmers picked the ones they liked the best, and so they controlled the direction of evolution, so these things are totally not natural. The plants and animals we grow today in farms don't exist in nature, are domesticated, can't survive in nature anymore, need to be nurtured by humans. There's nothing natural about them. But what they really are is far more genetically disrupted than genetically engineered plants, and I prefer the term genetically engineered. If you look at genetically engineered crops, and here's a review from 2011, there's been a number of other papers that confirm what this says. They basically looked at the papers that dealt with what kind of changes in DNA, what kind of changes in protein, and what kind of changes in metabolites, and what kind of changes in transcription or expression of genes could you find in GM crops, and how did that compare to what you would find in conventional crops? And what they found, in a word, was that GM crops are more like the parent from which they were bred than are other conventional crops like one another in the different varieties of crops. So the different variety of crops are a lot more different than GM varieties of crops are from their parent. That is, GM breeding causes less change than any other method of breeding. When the American Association for the Advancement of Science polled its members recently in association with a Pew Research study, they found that 89% of the scientists, many of whom are not agricultural scientists, these are like physicists and chemists and all sorts of things, even some sociologists and psychologists, 89% believe that genetically modified foods are safe. That's 1% more than believed in climate change, which is this next one down here. Now, I want to point out that's an unscientific poll, and I'm going to return to that point a little later. But do accept that the vast majority of scientists do not have concerns about the safety of GM crops. And we've been planting them for 20 years, and there's not a single mortality or illness ever shown caused by GM crops, period. Not a single one in the world. So, nonetheless, we have this problem. You see these 2 Americans who are engaging in probably what is a not health productive behavior, saying that they won't eat anything that's genetically modified because it could be unhealthy. And Peter Samnon, I thought, had a great quote for this: the risks that kill people and the risks that upset people are completely different. And that's why you had that misalignment on the very 3rd or 4th slide I had of what consumers are worried about and what scientists are worried about. I guarantee you that if we don't have enough food in 2050, that's going to be serious. Okay, so all of those things I showed you about glyphosate being dangerous, neonics being dangerous, GMOs being dangerous, are these little memes that have been planted in people's minds and propagated throughout our culture like rogue genes. And so why do the activists focus on creating these popular memes? And they've all been planted by activist organizations. People don't invent in their own mind that GMOs are dangerous. They don't even know what a GMO is, and they don't even think about GMOs. Someone had to tell them that. Someone had to tell them that MSG was dangerous or that pesticides were dangerous, and that's an industry. I'll talk more about that industry in a moment. But I want to talk a little bit about some fundamental human psychology. Risk perception is not rational, it's not quantitative. It's frankly emotional and intuitive. We're disproportionately fearful of that which is new, what we don't understand, what we can't control, and about which there is uncertainty. Basically, risks get spread around because we're storytellers. Think about it. We evolved without schools. When we were cavemen, back in the paleo days, when we ate that paleo diet, we just told our kids and we told the community our experiences, and they shared their experiences, and that's how we learned things. So, and that's how we learned our family history and the history of our people, and all that was all by oral tradition. So humans basically are very good storytellers, or at least after they acquired language, they became good storytellers. And it turns out that we're so good that, especially if a story confirms our biases, that we'll actually believe a story in the face of facts that are contrary to the story we're believing. The other thing about us is, of course, we're very tribal. We seek peer confirmation and alliance in the face of risk. We band together. You saw a lion and everybody just huddled around, picked up their spears and defended themselves. So Dan Kahan at Yale has a project called the Cultural Cognition Project, along with a bunch of other Yale faculty, that talks about some of the consequences of our tribal behavior, and the fact that now over the internet we can form new tribes. We can reach out to people and form alliances, and we can spread memes to our tribe mates through the internet. And so we've become a new kind of multi-tribal people. You might almost think of having networks of tribes. They're all formed through these exchanges on the internet. And because we have these memes, we don't have to explain a lot. If I say glyphosate and you're of a certain mindset, you know what the problem is, right? So we don't need to talk about it a lot. The worst part about this for an educator who likes to spend a lot of time explaining stuff to people, and even for companies that try to explain why their product, is safe, is that when you start saying, just let me explain this to you, I can explain the science and you won't worry about it, it turns out that the psychology has been studied, and this is called the diffusion or deficit model. It's filling a deficit in information. That doesn't work very well. As a matter of fact, people are perverse. If I believe something strongly and you show me facts that contradict it, I will more strongly believe what I believed. I will reject you because you're making me make a choice. Give up what I believe and give up what my tribe believes, or accept a fact that's disruptive. Can't do that. Let me introduce a couple other characters. The elephant and the rider. How many have heard about the elephant and the rider? Well, that's your brain. Brain's divided into an elephant and a rider. And these are an image concocted by a moral psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, whose book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, explores the evolution of morality and what are the key drivers, the modules that make us all behave universally around the globe the same way morally. I know it doesn't look that way. There are cultural differences, but he distills it down to 5 key things that we share in common with all mankind, that we're the product of moral evolution. And in this process, psychologists have also started to term our brain as having an intuitive or impulsive brain and a rational or thinking brain. He calls them the elephant and the rider, and he likens it to being that the elephant makes these quick intuitive decisions. The rider's job is to try to control the elephant by thinking about it, but of course the elephant's faster than the rider, and so what the rider has to do at the end of the day, because remember you're part of a community or a tribe, is explain to everybody why the elephant did what he did. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman follows on the 2-part brain and talks about a bunch of experiments about how what he calls the fast brain, the elephant, works, and how the slow brain works, and what the properties of both are. And these are just fascinating books. I highly recommend Thinking Fast and Slow and The Righteous Mind. This is really more aimed at, as you can see at the end, at religious and politics, but it tells you a lot about yourself and a lot about the way other people are operating. If you really want to do a quick once-over, just click on this link when you get this talk, or Google "The Voices in My Head Told Me to Believe," and you'll get a much shorter article that kind of deals with the implications of all this with regard to food. And he calls it the Homer brain and the Spock brain. So now let's give an example of this. If I ask people whether they want mandatory labeling of GM containing food products, 93% will say yes. And they give you that answer very quickly because that's the elephant answering. They don't have any idea what you're talking about, and you've just led them to a conclusion by asking the question that way. It's a leading question. If I, on the other hand, ask people if there's anything else you'd like on food labels that now isn't on food labels, 4% will say they want GM foods labeled. That's the rider thinking. It's the difference between the elephant and the rider. So what's behind these advocacy groups that are spreading these memes? Well, it turns out there's probably 850 of them in North America that work in the food, agriculture, dietary supplement, animal, area, and at least 500 have been tracked by Jay Byrne at Vfluence. In 2015, they spent over $10 billion programming fears into people, and of course fighting for things, like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, fighting for things that they think are important. And so there are a lot of people who are ideologically persuaded to donate to them, who really believe in their causes, but there are also a lot of companies that give them money to target their competition's products by spreading fears. And that's their primary source of income. So it's really a business, and they're really not-for-profit organizations. They know how to tell stories very well. They're good storytellers because we, of course, are persuaded by good stories. Their stories focus first on health and safety, then on environmental issues, and then on political issues. All of their stories have villains, victims, and heroes. They are allegories, and that just works on people. And Jay has written a very good paper about this, so I won't belabor it. Basically, I'll let you read the cartoon. Many of their stories are anti-corporate, anti-technology, anti-risk-taking, or anti-government. That's kind of the mindset they push. You always have to have a villain somewhere, right? And of course, villains sometimes present themselves. I mean, look, the Volkswagen scandal is unbelievable corporate behavior. This peanut company CEO approved the use of products that he knew to be tainted with salmonella and killed people. And so he was sent to prison, which is almost never happens in a food safety case. But this is deliberate manslaughter. So yeah, companies can do bad things. And so what you do is you take that paintbrush and you paint it over, for example, scientists. When scientists say things that you can't refute, what do you do with them? How do you stop them? Yeah, you say they're shills for industry. I've been called a shill for Monsanto. Why? Because what I say is 100% consistent with what the National Academy of Science says, with what WHO says, with what FAO says, with what all my colleagues say, what all the scientific societies say, what the scientific literature says. When somebody is consistent with that, they can't be a shill for anybody. They're simply telling the science as it is. But what they hope is that by calling me a shill, you won't believe me because you'll feel I'm sullied by payment from industry. So let me try to finish up in the last few minutes by talking about what's really at stake here. I believe that this whole advocacy movement, which is very closely coordinated, which works together, which is planned, is part of a different kind of socio-political process that knows that it can't win elections. It's incredibly hard to get into the election business, but they want to have political influence, so they're doing it through the food and agricultural sector and through anti-corporate behavior. And, frankly, a lot of that's earned by corporations, so it was a smart choice. They paint themselves as pro-people, pro-environment, anti-globalization, and anti-corporate. Can't be all bad, right? I mean, that'll ring a few bells, but they take billions of dollars from corporations. They have a lot of arguments against agriculture. They don't like industrial agriculture. They say we should use agroecological methods, and they are really opposed to chemicals. So I want to explore their model for the last few minutes of this talk. We're told that we should adopt a village-centered agroecological approach, and we shouldn't use chemical fertilizers or industrial agriculture and GMOs because they're really part of the problem. And what we should become is small farmers using renewable local resources and to return to harmony with our land. This is a place that never existed, and if you farmed, you know it wasn't this way. But that's the image. So let's look at a few facts and then put this all together into a conclusion about whether this is going to work. So this is the increase in soybean yields with time, and when GM crops were introduced, you notice the yield rate increase took off. This is the increase in corn yields with time, and I'm going to talk a little bit about corn in a minute. And then we get better and better when hybrid crosses come in, they really take off, and then GM crops come in, and the rate of improvement really takes off. And this is maize yields in Europe, and isn't this interesting? They didn't accept GM crops, and their increase in yield has been flat. So they've lost the benefit of the technology. Let me put that in graphic terms for you. In the United States today, we plant about 124,000 square miles of corn in 2009 anyway. If we were using 1925 methods, we would need 727,000 or 728,000 square miles to produce the same amount of corn. That's the importance of increasing yields in agriculture. While we're talking about yield, I want to remind you, and I am deliberately picking on organic because it's such a press favorite and media favorite. Organic is less productive. What this chart is how well the organic crop does compared to 100%. The conventional crop is set at 100. And for most crops, the organic crop produces considerably less per acre, on average about 40% less. So let's see what a switch to natural and organic and ecological methods means for producing the U.S. corn crop. Well, remember I said about the state of New Mexico is how much corn we have. Now that's kind of silly because, of course, the state of New Mexico isn't a flat field that we could, plant. This is sort of symbolic. I mean, actually very little of our land is suitable for large-scale corn agriculture. It has to be, flat fields and arable land and sufficient water and all those, the right climate and all those other things. But let's just pretend we grow all our corn in New Mexico. And what we want to do is we want to fertilize this with non-chemical fertilizer. So that means manure, okay? So we're going to need a lot of cows, right? And the way you can figure out if just taking a sort of average number, if we've got 9 square miles of pasture are required to produce enough poop to fertilize a square mile of corn, we'd need 1,115,000 square miles of corn. And to get to the point, we'd need 288 million methane-producing cows to make enough manure to provide enough nitrogen to grow that corn crop. And of course, methane is a potent greenhouse gas. This would be highly carbon-intensive, running around collecting all of this poop to put on New Mexico. Now, I mentioned organic yields are only at best 75% with corn. If you go back to that other chart, you'll see it's really about 70%, which means that we'd really need about 12 states devoted 100% to 384 million cows to produce enough manure to grow corn organically. It ain't going to happen. Now, many of the suggestions for agroecological methods and organic methods and natural methods don't do the math. There isn't enough nitrogen in the world to grow all of our crops organically. It cannot be done. Can't even feed half the people in the world today with it. And there are a lot of other limitations like that. We don't have that much arable land. There aren't 9 states left to plant to grow all those cows. So, I mean, there's some serious logic problems here. So do the math, get the evidence, run the numbers, and help people understand that. Now, the real question here, and it's a good environmental question, is why are we growing all this corn in the first place? We feed corn to animals, and here I am at an animal institute saying that, but gee, do we need all those animals? Or should we all become vegetarians? That's actually something we have to debate out. That's a real issue. And of course, we make ethanol, and at the end of the day, less than 10% of our corn actually goes to food and food ingredients. So maybe we don't need all that corn, and maybe there is some room here for discussion between these two different points of view to come to some kind of compromise that maybe we need very, very intensive agriculture but to produce less of this particular crop and spare land and resources. And just an example of the kind of discussion we really ought to be having with one another instead of arguing over the fence about whose system we should adopt. We should adopt any system that's going to help us do better, more sustainable agriculture. At the end of the day, high yields save nature, and this is out of a paper by Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for being the father of the Green Revolution. Every land acre that we increase productivity of is acres that we don't use for agriculture and natural resources that are spared from agriculture. Let me close with a bottom line. When you tell me it's not my job, and everybody says that, that's the wrong answer. It is your job. You live here, and your children are going to live here, and you need to be involved in this discussion. And if in particular you work in agriculture or food, you need to be helping people understand what these issues are and how to think about them scientifically. And that's going to be tough. I like this Edmund Burke saying, all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. And that's what's happening. There's no pushback against all of that activist messaging. So what can you do about it? Well, speak out, get engaged, do the math, help others find good sources of information so that they can listen to their rider instead of their elephant. Don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. The real thing, and I just made this appeal, is we've got to learn to be pragmatic. Maybe a word I should have put up here was agnostic. It shouldn't matter to me whether it's organic or natural or ecological or industrial or any of those things. Is it going to work? Is it going to be sustainable? You know, is it going to do less damage than what we're doing today by the kind of agriculture we do? And Ted Nordhaus is a multimillionaire who really started, worrying about this sort of thing. He and I forget his partner founded the Breakthrough Institute out in California, and you might look at their page at thebreakthrough.org and read their eco-modernist manifesto. Basically, their premise is, hey, there aren't winners or losers here, except all of us are going to lose if we don't solve some of these big challenges. How can we go about this in a sane, rational, and communal way to approach some of these problems? And that's just one example. I pick it because they've really done a good job of sort of articulating their position. Now, I often get asked, because there are a lot of true believers out there. Remember, I said that there are people who do this for profit, but there are also people who do this because they really believe in their position. And you have to respect that. They've thought through it. Their neighbors have influenced them. Their tribe has spoken to them. Their elephant's spoken to them. They know what they feel, and they feel strongly and passionately, just as strongly and passionately I do about science and technology and getting it right. So what do you do with a true believer who won't listen to you and gets upset when you try to communicate? I would say I wouldn't spend a lot of time on them, quite frankly. They're entitled to what they believe. They're going to believe what they believe. And you're asking them to betray their elephant and their chosen tribe. So that's not your job. Not everybody's going to buy in to pragmatic and agnostic solutions to real problems. My advice to you is that all begins with winning a battle for hearts and minds, and that begins with us learning how to tell a better and more compelling story and being willing to explain what's wrong with their narrative. And if you notice, I spent a lot of time, instead of talking about positive things, which I'd like to talk about, and what good science we could do, I spent a lot of time talking about the flaws in their narrative. I work in cooperation or collaboration with John Entine at the Genetic Literacy Project. I recommend that site. Jay Byrne is our issues and public opinion person. And I have a site called academicsreview.org where I critically reviewed Jeff Smith's last book. So, and we put other stuff up there occasionally too. I just don't have interest in becoming a blogger. Anyway, my quick conclusions. The traditional food and agriculture sector is being massively outspent on key issues. The food and agricultural sector is being strategically and tactically outplayed. And part of that is because the industry is so dumb and so poor at public relations. I mean, I wish I were running industry's public relations, or Jay was maybe. The food and ag sector is actually at risk of losing their freedom to innovate, and it's becoming impossible to use science and technology to solve food and ag challenges. I want to return in a second to two things. One is good cartoons. I use this cartoon to capture that if you don't understand what your problem is, then you're never going to solve your problem. And here's two cavemen who are saying something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, yet nobody lives past 30. So you want to make sure you understand the source of your problem. And finally, I want to return to little Ori. Little Ori is now just a little over 2 years old. He's here at his first art class, but I always imagine in this picture, he's saying, Grandpa, what are you going to do about it? You've done nothing in 2 years. The situation's gotten worse in the 2 years since he was born, and we're playing with his future. And I'd like you to help me make that a better future. Thank you.